Vietnam was caught up in the middle of the Cold War, whether they wanted to be in it or not. A communist lifestyle greatly impacted the economy and political landscapes of the country, specifically in the North, and this political ideology was adopted during the Cold War. The United States and Vietnam used to disagree quite a lot because of contrasting beliefs, but nowadays our relationship with each other has changed. Finally, we will explore the state of the country as of today and try to decide which level of development it is currently at.
Hello everyone. The Cold War primarily took place in Europe. Everything mostly revolved around Europe, and more specifically Germany. But that's not the only place that was affected. Today, my group and I are going to explore another country that was affected by the Cold War, Vietnam. In the early 1900s, Vietnam didn't really exist. It was part of the French Indochina, which was ruled by France. A young Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh started a revolution and asked communists to help. Ho's new Indochinese Communist Party led a revolt and struck against the French. The French, understandably, didn't quite like this. "Hey, what are you doing? Leading a revolt against you. We will rise up." No. The French started putting people in jail. They sentenced Ho Chi to execution. Ho Chi fled in exile. In 1941, Ho Chi returned. At this time, Japan had control due to World War II. He formed the Viet Minh Independence League with other Vietnamese nationalists. However, the Japanese were forced out of Vietnam when World War II ended in 1945. France was planning to regain control of the country. The French took control of cities in Vietnam. However, because of clever hit-and-run tactics by the Viet Minh, they were able to keep them out of the countryside parts of the country. The war between France and Viet Minh ended in 1954, with France surrendering, as usual. Since communism helped Vietnam win, the U.S. was pretty scared that Vietnam would be fully communist. Because of this, the U.S. used the Truman Doctrine and its policies as a way to allow them to engage in Vietnam affairs in order to halt their spread of communism. If nothing were to happen, as President Eisenhower would put it, it would be a domino effect of communism. An international peace conference known as the Geneva Convention was held to discuss what they were going to do with Vietnam. They decided to split it into two parts, the North and the South, which seems to be a common theme after wars. They were divided at 17 degrees north, which is a totally useful fact to include. The North was governed by Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist, and the South by Ngo Dinh Diem, who was an anti-communist. The South was a dictatorship, better than communism, at least to the U.S. Some citizens were not happy because of this, and formed a pro-communist group in South Vietnam called the Viet Cong. Their group grew over time, and it all led up to the Viet Cong assassinating Diem. The United States was sweating bullets, both literally and figuratively. They tried to combat the increasing spread of communism with escalated military strength. We sent more planes, guns, and other military necessities. Hey, why are we attacking Vietnam? Oh, they sunk our boats. But why would they? Because the difficulties of fighting in unknown terrain were becoming more apparent, we straight up just bombed parts of the North so that we could reveal where enemy soldiers were hiding. In the 1960s, young Americans began to oppose the war because it was overseas. It didn't affect the majority of the general public, and it cost too many lives for what it was worth. In 1969, Nixon began to withdraw troops from Vietnam, listening to the public outcry. However, he had a sneaky plan called the Vietnamization. It was conceived to pull American troops out of Vietnam, but have South Vietnam increase their combat role. Later, Nixon authorized a bombing on North Vietnamese bases and supply routes. Despite his best efforts, the public outcry was too strong, and Nixon officially withdrew the last United States troops from Vietnam in 1973. In 1975, South Vietnam was overrun by the Communist North. Oh, crap. The North set up camps in the South to convince the people that communism was the way to go. Some people felt oppressed because of this, and this ended up with the consequence of 1.5 million people fleeing the country, mainly by boat. How developed is Vietnam exactly? Well, it's complicated, and we're going to have to go through a bit of data. Here we go. GDP per capita explains how healthy the economy is on average. For Vietnam, it is currently $6,900, which is relatively low. This could have occurred because of the communist influence that occurred in the country in the Cold War. Communism usually forces people to sustain agricultural lifestyles, which means a less sustainable economy. Also, communism strips some freedoms from individuals, hurting economic growth. Infant mortality rate tells us how many infants die, which is pretty self-explanatory. For Vietnam, this value is 15.7 per 1,000. In communist societies, there is less quality of healthcare, which explains the above-average amount of deaths. The labor force tells us how many people work in certain fields of occupation. About 40% of the population works in agricultural fields. As stated before, this is often the case in communist societies. GDP per sector tells how much money parts of the economy make. Services make over half the money, mainly due to tourism. Tourism to Vietnam increased after attention was drawn to the beautiful Vietnamese landscapes after the Vietnam War, and how these settings were portrayed in popular media internationally. Land use tells us, well, what land is used for. Forests overtake agricultural land, which seems to indicate that agriculture has less of an effect on the economy and other aspects. In reality, it's because much of the land is not arable due to over-farming. Looking at these data points, there's a lot of markers for both developed and undeveloped countries. There's a nice middle ground, which these data points suggest, that Vietnam is a newly industrialized country. You may think that after the Vietnam War, the US and Vietnam would kind of despise each other, but they've taken many steps to be good chums with each other. The US publicly supports Vietnam. There are 30,000 Vietnamese students studying abroad in the US. This was in 2019. Stay safe, COVID is bad. In 2016, the U.S. lifted trade bans on Vietnam. The U.S. invested about $10 billion into Vietnam. Exports to Vietnam grew by 77% from 2014 to 2016. The U.S. assists Vietnam's response to climate change. Bilateral trade between the U.S. and Vietnam increased to $52 billion. The U.S. supports Vietnam's law enforcement professionalization. They signed a letter to increase cooperation in law enforcement and the justice sector, and both work together to continue implementing changes impacting this agreement. Both also hold annual dialogues for labor and human rights. The countries have declared to support each other. The U.S. and Vietnam established a group for the Cooperation Humanitarian and Medical Storage Initiative. They signed a Peace Corps country agreement. We get it, the relationship has strengthened, now please stop talking. Okay.
The Cold War left Vietnam in a general state of destruction. At the time, Vietnam was using communism as their economic system. Along with that, the north and south parts of Vietnam were still fighting, even though they weren't necessarily at war. People were fleeing since they set up communist training camps to get people to appreciate communism. Even when the war was over, there was a lot of conflict once the fighting stopped. However, the economy is recovering over time. Since they are starting to adopt a more capitalist economy, in the next 100 years or so, Vietnam may be as developed as the first world countries we have today. Thank you for listening.
Yep, that's it. That's the project. Happy Halloween. You're watching this on Monday. What am I saying? Thanks to everyone else in the group for doing the majority of the research. I honestly just did the video. Yeah, this was interesting.